Hi, I'm Professor McCoy. Today I want to talk about St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. First of all, sorry about the video quality and perhaps the audio. I'm recording from my office from a webcam today, so I'll have to deal with that. So, the first thing to note, St. Anselm was an 11th century monk who wrote what was the first and most prominent wholly a priori argument for the existence of God. If you're not familiar with the distinction between a priori and a posteriori, I have a link to my video explaining that distinction as well as a couple of others in the description. So take a look at that if you're not familiar with it. Otherwise, suffice to say that it is, as an a priori argument, it only relies on purely logical premises. It doesn't go into any empirical data, it doesn't require any particular knowledge about things in the world, only about the structure of thought and the structure of logic. So, what are those premises? So, first of all, he has certain background metaphysical principles that are at work for this argument. One of which he does not explicitly state, but he does utilize, which is, broadly speaking, the convertibility of the transcendentals, and specifically the convertibility of being and goodness, which I've also have a video outlining, which again I'll have a link to in the description. Specifically, what this means is that, in essence, to be at all, to exist, is to be good insofar as something exists. And so, put another way, existence is a precondition for any kind of goodness or perfection, which thus makes existence qua any sort of thing, at least, goodness qua that same kind of thing. All right, so moving on from this, keeping this in mind as background, he begins by noting that quoting from the Psalms, from Psalm 14, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. Now, he's arguing that not only is the existence of God demonstrable from only logical first principles, but also that the existence of God is, because of this, self-evident. The existence of God is irrefutable. One cannot reasonably entertain the possibility or reasonably think that God does not exist if his argument is correct. So, how? How does the fool think this? So he goes on to explain what is being meant by the term God. How are we to understand God in this context? And in this translation, which is by Thomas Williams, God is explained as that than which a greater cannot be thought. Right. So I'll say that again, that than which a greater cannot be thought. Or in other words, the maximally perfect possible being. And when I say possible, is because we're talking about what can or cannot be thought. So we're talking about logical possibility, not merely what any given finite human mind can think of. So this is to do with what is conceivable in the abstract, what is logically possible, what is logically consistent, rather than what any given person can think of. So, God is defined as whatever it is that is the maximally perfect, or that which it is impossible to conceive of anything greater in any way. So, from this he points out, all right, so if God is defined as having all of the great-making qualities, as we might say in more contemporary discussions of this, what are those? So, well, they have to be things that are always and for everything better to be than not to be. So they can't be things like taller or shorter or red or blue, because it isn't always and for everything better to be tall or better to be short or better to be red, better to be blue, etc. Right? Finite physical qualities like that are situationally dependent. They're perfective of things, they make things better, but only insofar as they are a particular kind of thing rather than being itself. So what sort of things are these perfections that would make our concept of God wholly perfect? And these are what we would call either transcendentals or, more broadly, unqualified perfections, which means an unqualified perfection is that which is always makes something better, no matter what it is, no matter what the circumstances. It's always better to be this than not to be for anything, no matter what it is, no matter what the circumstances. A transcendental is something that at its utmost winds up being convertible with one another. It winds up being a perfection of itself, not of a particular kind of thing. Things like goodness, truth, beauty, possibly knowledge, possibly aseity, which aseity is a term for metaphysical independence, roughly speaking. So, with all of these qualities, how does this tell us that something that has all of these qualities, so the concept of something that has all of these qualities, has to actually exist in reality? We can look at the argument in two ways. The first I want to go through very straightforwardly how Anselm describes it, and then I'll take a look at it from another perspective, in a sense through the lens of Aquinas' fourth way, which has some different premises and slightly different structure, which hopefully I'll get to at another time. But understanding things in terms of gradation, things of being better or worse, is a way of, I think, understanding Anselm's argument as independent from Aquinas'. So all right, how does Anselm explain this himself? Well, he says that, okay, so for something to be perfectly good, for something to be that than which nothing a greater cannot be thought, it has to have all the perfections. Everything has to be perfect about it. In other words, it is impossible to think of something that would be better than this thing. So, okay, we have this idea in our mind, right? He says that it's possible to at least have this idea and hold this idea in our mind as long as we understand that this is what God means. So we have this idea. We have the idea in our mind of that than which a greater cannot be thought. So we have the maximally perfect being. We have the thought in our mind. So he asks, which is better, the thought of God, qua maximally perfect being, or God? And remember, if we're remembering that if that existence is better to exist than to not exist, because existence is a great-making quality, or it's an unqualified perfection, or even if it's not a quality, it's a precondition for any quality. Right? Something has to exist in order to be good in any way. Then the actual thing, the actual God, the actual thing that would fit this description of that than which a greater cannot be thought, would be greater than the mere thought of it. So by analogy, to look to a fellow monk, Gaunilo's criticism, but sort of twist it to our own purposes, a real island is better than the thought of an island. Right? It's a better island because it is an island. The thought is just a thought. It's an immaterial arrangement of concepts. It's not even an island per se. Just like the thought of God is not God per se, it is merely an arrangement of concepts. And so clearly, God would be better than this concept, better than this conceptual structure, this thought. And so, if our thought really is, if our idea of God really is that than which a greater cannot be thought, but it doesn't exist, then the actual God, the thing that would exist, hypothetically, would be better than that thought, would be better than what we're thinking of. And so, if it were the case that God did not exist, but we could entertain this thought of that than which a greater cannot be thought, this maximally perfect being, we would not in fact be considering maximally perfect being. We'd be considering something just short of maximal perfection, because maximal perfection would exist, because that would be better than what we would be otherwise thinking of if this didn't exist. And so if the contrary of some possibility, if the contrary is a contradiction, then that other a possibility must be the case. So it must be the case that God does exist, that than which a greater cannot be conceived actually does exist, because if it did not, the very concept of it would be self-contradictory. And, presumably, this is a possible concept. Now note that this concept is difficult to grasp, and this has been one of the largest critiques of the ontological argument. Generally, the the argumentative structure, the validity of the argument is seldom called into question, although there have been some criticisms of it. But more generally, the validity of the argument is accepted. But the premise, the possibility of this thought, the conceivability of maximal perfection, or the logical consistency of the idea of a maximally perfect being is what's called into question. And that is really where any real critique of theism that is supported by an ontological argument of this sort will come from. It'll come from a critique of the concept, right? An incoherence in the idea of God. This is where the problem of evil comes in. This is where paradoxes of omnipotence come in. This is where paradoxes of omniscience come in. Omniscience and contrariness, contradictory. The idea that omniscience is contradictory to future possibilities and contingencies and that sort of thing. So I also want to go over shortly another way of looking at this argument, which is, so if you have the idea of that than which a greater cannot be thought, you have this idea of a maximally perfect being, then saying that that is God is to say that whatever it is that is maximally perfect is appropriate to call that God. It's appropriate to call the best possible being, whatever that happens to be, it's appropriate to call that God. Right? And what is worship is, what it is to worship that is to acknowledge that it is the best conceivable or best possible being, the greatest thing. Right? So in this sense, we can point out that in order for something to be the greatest possible thing, it has to, once again, have these certain unqualified perfections and not have various contingent qualities that would make it either better or worse, only in certain circumstances. So, if something does have only great-making qualities, whatever it is that is maximally perfect insofar as all of those great-making qualities, and as long as those qualities do not contradict one another, that possible maximally perfect being must be God. So this is in a sense similar to Aquinas' argument from Gradation, that if there is any scale of being, right, if there are things that are better than other things, then there must be a maximally great being. There must be a top of the scale, and whatever is at the top of the scale is appropriately called God. But if there were any deficiency at that thing at the top of the scale, then there could be something greater. And then it wouldn't be maximally perfect. It would be suboptimal. It would be submaximal. Right? It wouldn't quite be perfect. It would be good, but not perfect. So that is to say that there must be something which is maximally perfect in order for various levels of perfection to occur. This is also, you can tie this into the late 20th century theologian Tillich, this idea of religion as utmost concern, so religion is seen as your religion is seen as whatever it is that you worship, and what you worship is what you hold at utmost importance. So, if this is correct, then everyone holds this idea of something, which is the greatest possible thing. Now different people think that it's different things. One conception of that has to ultimately be correct, simply because there can only be one thing which is wholly perfect, for reasons I may explain elsewhere, and for reasons especially that Anselm outlines in other parts of his work. But suffice it to say that everyone does hold something to be maximally perfect, worthy of worship in a sense. So, hopefully this has clarified some of Anselm's argument. I may go into more detail in another video, and I may go into detail elsewhere as well. And I'm also going to have a few links in the description to descriptions, both video and written descriptions of different versions of this ontological argument, more updated versions, for example, Alvin Plantinga's, just to get to lend some other perspectives on what I think is, even if not correct, and whether this argument is sound or not has a lot to do with whether the concept of God is, as described here, is coherent. it certainly has had a great influence on the philosophy of religion, and it certainly has had a it stands unique in the various arguments for the existence of God, not only because it's entirely a priori, but also because it describes, like a few others, but it describes God in a particular kind of way as maximally perfect, rather than merely describing God as something that could be construed as, in terms of deism, something like that. This makes that distinction. This makes the distinction that a supremely powerful but still finite creator could not be considered God. Only maximally perfect being, that than which no greater can be thought, can be considered God. So hopefully that clarifies some things, and hopefully that lays out the argument. I will also I will include the text in the description of Anselm's initial argument here, so you can take a look at it yourself and see what you think as well. So with that, I will hopefully see you in the next video.